Hello, this is Richard Oliveto with the Midwest Center, and this is a week after almost Charlie Kirk was killed in Utah and in Idaho. I'm sorry, and we we are here. We at the Midwest Center uh, are saddened by the fact that there's political violence of this nature happening. My son, who is not a close follower of Charlie Kirk, and his close friend here we were together when we got the news. We had just had uh, lunch in a local restaurant here in our southeastern Ohio city, and oddly enough, we were talking about the '60s. My son is 23. His friend was 26. And I was explaining to them the impact of the '60s and early '70s with Kent State assassinations with Kennedy and his brother Robert and Martin Luther King and others of that era, Malcolm X, and the impact it had on us who were alive then. We're very young. I was very young. I was still really a child in the '60s, younger than I was in sixth grade when Robert Kennedy was killed, so I was 4 when John Kennedy was killed. And I remember John Kennedy's funeral. It was one of my earliest memories. My father's arm around me. I remember how the sun was coming through the back windows of our living room, watching the funeral procession of the horse-drawn casket of John F. Kennedy going down Pennsylvania Avenue with Jackie and others walking behind Robert, rocking with her. It was very moving, and it stays with me, and it stayed with me all my life. And then Martin Luther King assassination. I remember my sister running down the steps. We're all getting ready for school, and we were living in a house, a 3-story house, where the kids were upstairs, and my sister went running downstairs. She was older, and she started screaming, "They killed him!" So, and then we, it was just stunner, and I kind of just remember the impact on our. As a young kids, we knew something serious had happened. I was in sixth grade, and we went to school, and then Robert Kennedy was shot. We were at the end of school year on our last days, and I was in the sixth grade, and we were sitting around that morning. The teachers were stunned. The officials were just non-visible. All us kids were just sitting around in the classroom talking. I remember talking on top of my desk, sitting on top of my desk, talking about his death, and we were in sixth grade. And so, of course, it had a great influence on our generation. And I never, ever felt those assassinations were single person assassinations. They were not part of a conspiracy, a real conspiracy, not some theoretical ideal or somebody's creation. They were true planned assassinations, political assassinations that took this country in a completely different direction. Johnson came after Jack Kennedy's assassination in the Vietnam War, which split this country horrifically, and all that would follow from that. Even though Kennedy had signed the orders to get out, and it was signed, an executive order was signed to get the troops out, and they were only there for like a couple of years to begin with, and there were only 3,000 or 4,000 of them, and there were some communication workers that I met later in life, much later. Right here in our town, there was a young black man that had been sent to Vietnam in the '62, and he says they were setting up satellite dishes, communication dishes, and paving runways. When the order came in October and early November of that year, they were going to be out by Christmas, and they were looking forward to getting home. They started deconstructing the very things they had created. He told me that as soon as Kennedy was killed, they got the notice that to stop deconstructing, and he said that he remained in Vietnam for another several years. He says, but they were told before Kennedy was killed that they were going home and be home by Christmas. So it was clearly a directive that was going to end the Vietnam U.S. involvement. and somebody didn't want that. Those in Washington and the war machine didn't want that. The CIA and the deep state, as they call it today. So having been affected, and at this lunch I was talking about that with my young son and his close friend. We came home, and we were walking to say goodbye to her. She had driven her own vehicle, and she turns and says, "Oh my God, Charlie Kirk, do you know who he is? He was shot." And I says, "I think I know Charlie Kirk. I didn't follow him closely, but I'd heard about him. And again, I knew he was technically a right-wing, conservative young person who, was influential, but that's all I knew. And I had heard some things a few months before, curiously, from people like Max Blumenthal and others in the more liberal podcasts. And so I began to get curious about Charlie Kirk. But she showed us the video, and it was a brutal, brutal video. It was fresh. And my son witnessed it, and he knew exactly who he was because he had followed him 10 years ago when he first came out with shorts on and sat in front of a camera like this and just started talking from his own room, when he was really not too much, and he was just somebody going out and just beginning his journey. My son wasn't a right-wing MAGA follower. He wasn't somebody who votes for MAGA, but my son graduated from Howard University last year in 2024. He certainly wasn't on the conservative MAGA train or youth movement or Turning Point, but he knew, and he instantly was traumatized by the sight of the brutality, but he also was traumatized just by the fact that an assassination occurred. Obviously, we saw it instantly. This wasn't some shooting like in the street, or somebody just doing something stupid, or fault of just something of an angry exchange between somebody and somebody pulling out a gun. This was a political, clear-sighted, single shot to the neck assassination. It was brutal. And my son really reacted hard. He had a very difficult time for the next hour. Part of it was witnessing someone get shot like that on camera in real time. And my son plays a ton of war games and video games, and he is not unfamiliar to difficulties and struggles in this life, in this world. He has been through a lot, and nothing like this, of course. And never, thank God, never seen anybody shot personally, nor. But he has faced some very close, very, very close people to him being killed, actually being killed. But he hasn't witnessed this, and it really bothered him. And it was very disturbing in the sense that it was such a difficult moment for him that it hit him in a way that I can't really explain. And then I said, this is exactly, if not more so, a pivotal moment in this country's history for the young people. It was their age, their generation has now had somebody who is involved in social media the way they are, who grew up around social media and blew up because of social media. And because of that, they have now witnessed a political assassination, and they've experienced what it does to this country. I condemn that. Nobody, as much as I'm really, really strident and I'm very hard on Trump and his minions and his followers, and I often make statements that are very strident against them. I don't talk about violence against them. I don't talk about bringing down the hammer on anybody. And it's just a political discourse, and it's a strong political, just like they were, just like Charlie Kirk was. He was not a gentle person when it came to his speech, and the record shows that he was not that kind of individual. And so it's very sad, however, to see the young generation, especially with his followers, being so ardently attached to him and thinking so highly of him. And he gave voice to a lot of young conservative kids, obviously across this country, whether he was right or wrong in his views, whether he was politically, I think, in times, not wise, and even though he was very, very successful, and he was groomed by billionaires really to become this. It was almost like he was hoisted up into this position over time by very, very, very powerful and wealthy interests, and he was kind of created, but he fit the perfect um, archetype for a kind of a young person who was willing to go out and speak and debate. He never went to college. He never went to. In fact, he talked about not going to college, and he kind of prided himself on that. And the idea was he felt that American universities were not teaching the Western civilization. And I have to agree to a large degree that a lot of the curriculum that's in today's colleges, I was stunned by what my son was not taught as a political science and a history major, and the things that the smattering of American history that they got. And even when they talked about some um, current events like the Kennedy assassination in his senior year, um, the way it was discussed was pallid. It was weak, and it did not even include his Kennedy's political contributions to this country. The professor, my son told me at one point, spent a whole class on JFK's affairs, and I thought, we're paying excellent money, good money, an expensive education for a senior level professor to spend a whole class almost on John F. Kennedy's affairs. And I think he included a question on the examinations about Kennedy's affairs. I mean, you could read that in any tabloid magazine. And so if that's what Charlie Kirk was critical of, I know he was critical of more of a DEI kind of criticism, but even that, to really, I thought to myself, with all the contributions and all the impact that John F. Kennedy had, the historical president of the 19th century, 20th century, and 1960s, to have that person in his class not talk about the real seminal change that John F. Kennedy brought to this country and was bringing to this country, and the things that his idealism and the way he became a world figure, not just a United States figure, but a world-class figure of the first tier on anyone's. John F. Kennedy, to this day, in Asia and Japan, is still considered one of the most popular presidents of all time in those countries 60 years later. So the idea that, and of course Germany and his Ike Beam Berlin speech, which is just, historical speeches of the 20th century, one of the top five, and Kennedy's peace speech and his civil rights speech of 63, they're so meaningful, and to this day you can learn so much about where things were and where things were going, and where we were going ahead with him, and then what didn't happen because of his assassination. So having talked like that, and my son and I having discussed, I was truly stunned. And so I was looking into Charlie Kirk's background more fully. But one of the things that I had, like many, many, many people I am discovering, have had an opinion of, even on YouTube, many, many podcasts of people with way more influence than I ever will have, began, I felt, almost within seconds of his assassination. I instantly told my young son and his friend and our friend that I have a feeling this is either going to be related to a transgender violence, which I had no proof, or it was going to be Israel. And why I thought about Israel immediately was I had only seen a few reports, but I listened to him carefully a few months ago about Kirk's turning away from his 150% ardent support of Netanyahu and Israel. And I heard a little bit about that. And I thought to myself, just from my own understanding of politics and the conservative movement in this country and how Congress is just lockstep with Netanyahu and gave him 25 standing ovations back in last January, that it was almost intuitive to say that given what Israel was doing in the Mideast and the way they are so blatantly against anyone who just turns the slightest away from their demanded, expected, anticipated American second, Israel first policy, that we have to obey whatever Israel says is going to be the policy in the Mideast. They dictate the policy. They dictate our foreign policy. And really they dictate much of what we do even domestically to a certain degree, whether it's on the left or the right. So each president, every president has a very specific adherence and support to Israel since Kennedy. There's been no president since John F. Kennedy that has really said no outright to Israel, except for a few limited policy decisions, very limited. And that is because we have a country that is completely, at this point, completely under the thumb of Israel's donor class in terms of our politics, in terms of Washington, in terms of the presidential elections. And that means on both the left and the right. Biden, as Max Blumenthal has pointed out from the Gray Zone, Biden had his billionaire Jewish class donor, and so does Trump. And prior to that, the same was with Obama. The same was with George Bush. The same was with President Clinton. You can go back all the way back down to Nixon, LBJ. LBJ was 110% a Zionist, unlike Kennedy. And he allowed, as everyone knows, is getting aware of, I knew this years ago from a memo I had accidentally downloaded on my computer, that John F. Kennedy opposed Ben-Gurion, the founder of Israel, the first prime minister, of them having a nuclear weapon. He was against the arms race. He was trying to get the arms race under control, and it was one of his major policy points. He was working behind the scenes, nobody knew, with Khrushchev to seek a disarmament treaty. He got the first atmospheric nuclear ban, and he was proud of that. He got it even outside of the circles of the Congress. So, and Kennedy's famous peace speech in '63, which some professors say and some historians say it was probably the speech that got him killed. He spoke openly about a practical, pragmatic peace, not trying to change each other, not trying to agree with each other, but that we have to work to peace because there will be no humanity if we don't, because of the nuclear arms race. And Kennedy told Israel he will in no way allow them to become a nuclear state. He said he couldn't risk that and couldn't afford that because his policies were to stop this nuclear race. And he told them, if you get one, if I allow you to get one, he says, Russia or Soviet Union at the time will arm your neighbors, and they easily will have one. He says, we're going to have a Middle East filled with nuclear weapons. And it was a very pragmatic statement. I've heard people say, well, he wanted to disarm completely the whole entire American army of all nukes. I don't think so. He did want to stop the crazy nuclear arms race and the billions and billions of dollars that was being spent on testing and creating bigger and bigger weapons and more hypersonic missiles. And so Kennedy was seeking eventually, idealistically, the end of nuclearization of all states. And largely due to Kennedy's influence, only certain nations obtained the nuclear status. Well, Kennedy's assassinated in a year, not even a year later. Israel explodes its first nuke. Undetected, not allowed. LBJ allows them. He doesn't require them to become part of the world community of the nations, so they don't have to report their nuclear activities. He allows them to work like that for his entire administration, and they grow their nuclear weapons program. So, and ever since then, every president has spoken about the power of the Israeli lobby and its influence in this country. Nixon did in post-Watergate interviews. Jimmy Carter did years after he was out of office on Charlie Rose. He spoke about the control that AIPAC has over Congress and how much they impact the Oval Office policies and how complex it is to deal with the Mideast situation. And none of them denigrated Israel per se, and none of them denigrated the right to lobby, but they all said that control was outsized. It was well beyond anything any other organization, foreign government has inside of Washington, D.C. So you come down to the present, and what you see is Charlie Kirk turning. In the last months of his life, he began to turn away, because really what happened was turn away from Israel because he sees the youth, the young people across the country, conservative and liberal, not accepting what their parents in the boomer generation was fed and pushed, and the whole Holocaust guilt story that's been laid upon America and all the other nations of the world, that somehow we're all sort of like with the race issue has happened in this country. And I'm a civil rights lawyer, and I'm not a Charlie Kirk when it comes to civil rights, but how oftentimes today's generation is blamed for the racial issues of the 1860s, 1840s, and how, or the 1930s or the 1960s, and that oftentimes if you're an African American person who's an advocate or a professor, they tend to look through the lens that all white is one conglomerate, and they sometimes kind of almost make you feel as if us today, or even those families of those who were the slave owners, are somehow responsible for what happened 100 years ago, or 80 years ago, or 50 years ago. So, and we're not. And we're different people from that era, that culture, I would think. Now, what you find is that Charlie Kirk and the race issue is a whole other issue, and he is a whole different animal, and I don't agree with him 1%. When I start reading more about his statements after his death, I was stunned to see some of the things that he said about the Civil Rights Act, the 64 Civil Rights Act, what he said about Martin Luther King, how he viewed, and he made openly comments about black women and some comments about airline pilots that happen to be African American. I mean, he made some very ugly public statements about civil rights, and it seems as though he only began to make those strident remarks, more strident ones, after he hired a fired producer from Fox, a guy named Neff's, last name, who himself was fired because of his racist posts and policy and comments. And Fox even denounced him as they fired him and distanced themselves from his social media statements about race. Well, Charlie picks him up for the 24 election cycle, basically 23, and pretty soon Charlie starts espousing very racist statements. Putting the race issue aside for a moment, which makes very obvious that Charlie Kirk was no angel. He was not a saint. He gave us very open about his faith, which I admire. He was very strong about his belief in Jesus Christ as a savior, and he talked to students about that, and that was a good thing. And I think students, as a Christian, as a fellow Christian, that was a good thing that he was so strong. But I can't somehow rationalize this open, strong belief in Jesus Christ and the Christian faith with this growing, very, I would say, virulent, not violent, but virulent, which some people could say is violent, anti-African American or anti-civil rights stances that he took, and it was brutal. And what I don't understand about that, and I'll come to that later, is the funding he got, where this major funding came into his organizations in the last 8, 10 years of his life, which was really since he was 22. He's only 31 when he dies. He began to get hundreds of millions of dollars given to him. Well, who did the money really come from? Max Blumenthal and others point out that I think some of it came from his close ties to Donald Trump Jr. in the first Trump administrations, in the first Trump election. He attached himself to Donald Trump Jr. very, very early on, back in 2016. And I think the Trumps opened up the doors for his rise, in a sense, into political conservatism. Obviously they did. And then Trump's first administration, they liked him and they groomed him. But who really funded him, apparently, was the hardcore Zionistic Israeli Jewish donor class. It's obvious. I've seen the list of what you can find online, and the list is extraordinary. The millions and millions and millions of dollars that was poured in this young man's hands when he was in his 20s. Before he was 26, he had millions and millions of dollars handed to him in his quote-unquote nonprofit called Turning Point USA. It was obviously a design vehicle to court the next generation of would-be not only conservative voters, but ardent Zionistic Christian nationalist voters, and groom them into becoming full-fledged next generation supporters of Israel. It's not unmistakable, and it's not a false statement. It's not anti-Semitic to say that. He was very much groomed by, and Max Blumenthal even mentions a gentleman by the name of David Horowitz. I'm not familiar with him, but Max Blumenthal knows about him, and he says he was literally taken under the wing and groomed by this gentleman in terms of and he was flown to Israel on that free junket that they give young Jewish young people, and even our congressmen are flown there on these junkets, and they're introduced to Netanyahu and all the Israeli leaders of the right-wing Likud, and they're talked about how they're linked to the Christian messianic thinking and the Christian Zionistic nationalism that exists in this country, of which I just recently was exposed to by attending an evangelical church, who I love all the people in the church, but the pastor, who is a decent person, and his wife's a lovely person, very, very nice people, but they're very much in that same mold. They're evangelical Christians, who believe in the blood of Christ, and they also like the fact that Israel's spreading and spilling a lot of blood of the Palestinians. They don't mind. They think it's part of God's plan. It's bizarre. It's extremely bizarre, given where Charlie's faith was. I think it was. So for years, Charlie was an ardent Zionist, Christian Zionist, convincing or talking and spreading the gospel of how Christianity and Israel are tied. And we all know the history. We all, if you understand anything about Christianity, we all know the Judeo-Christian ethic. We all know how Christ comes from the culture of Judaism. We all know about the closeness of the religions, and we all know about the Old Testament and the New Testament. So that's not a surprise that anyone can read the scriptures and understand that. Ministers and priests, theologians, and laity all understand the historical roots of Christianity. So, but to make it into a weaponization issue in American politics is done by the Israeli Zionists' money and the AIPAC money and the big, big Jewish donors that from both Israel and the United States that just ferment this. You cannot vary away from the Zionistic thinking of the Mideast. As Biden said halfway through his last year, I am a Zionist. Well, so is Trump's even more of a Zionist. It turns out Trump and his son-in-law, Ivanka's husband, were very close to Netanyahu. Netanyahu used to stay in his son-in-law's house when he visited the United States, long before Trump was president. And so this idea that Charlie began to turn away from and question his, because he began to make open statements. The Epstein thing was one thing, and he really invited people like Tucker Carlson and others onto the platform that they believed that, and they said openly at Charlie Kirk's major yearly annual event that Epstein was a Mossad agent. And it was a very strong statement being made by conservative commentators with millions and millions of followers. So, and Charlie allowed that to happen on his platform. And then later he invited David Smith, which he was warned by certain ardent Zionists in this country not to put him on stage, because Smith speaks openly about Israel killing Gaza's innocents and the thousands and thousands of children. And Smith said, how can you lay Christianity, evangelical Christianity particularly, next to Israel's present secular government and say these two are equal, or they belong together? You can be a follower of Christ and support the government of Israel today, slaughtering women and children and innocents, and 230 journalists and hundreds of medical workers, and torturing them, and and etc. So Kirk began to platform some of the undermining voices of not the left, but people who just didn't believe in Israel's divine right to go after Palestinians because of October 7th, forgetting all the history that preceded October 7th of Israel attacking repeatedly the people in Gaza, in the West Bank, for decades. So as Kirk began to allow himself to think out of the box, so to speak, from where he was, even though he espoused, even down to the day he probably died, that he felt that Hamas's propaganda was responsible for the stories of starving children being shot. And he actually said that stuff on Megyn Kelly even a month before he was shot, that he believed there was a lot of propaganda that Hamas was putting out, which is totally, I want to say, I can say total bullshit. But the fact remained, as he said to Megyn Kelly in that last interview with her, he was really getting upset because he met with these quote-unquote Jewish stakeholders. They were the donor class that had helped fund him. That openly he was being told to stand down, to shut up about Epstein, to basically was being browbeaten into conformity, get back in line. You can't have millions of your young followers starting to think for themselves about this Gaza issue. And Kirk resisted that. He said he was American first. He said, he 100% believes in Israel, and he called it, quote unquote, a bulletproof resume on defending Israel, which he did. But at the same time, he began to see the reality that the young people by the millions in this country were not accepting the old Holocaust, guilt complex that Israel puts on every generation, every politician, that we have to support Israel because it's a democracy, because it's the only democracy, because it's such a great godly nation, that God has his hand on Israel, etc., etc., etc. And so what Kirk begins to do is change his, within himself, he starts to become more flexible on the issue, because he knows, as he says, almost off the camera, but it's on camera, in a focus group that he had of young students, he says, I'm trying to tell the uppers, obviously he meant Trump and his administration, that there's an earthquake coming. And he said, there's an earthquake coming. And he said, that's why I'm doing this, because he was trying to have the young people's voice get out in this social atmosphere, you might say the atmosphere of the social media, so the elders of the conservative movement can understand just what's coming in about 5 to 10 years, that these young voters are not going to be beholden and felt made to feel obligated to the Zionist state government, secular government of Israel, especially since, as Kirk even pointed out early on, they support a very gay agenda in Israel. And of course that goes against, that's anathema to the conservative right wing in this country and the Christian movement, the evangelical movement. What I found out very recently was Kirk really began to have some doubts among his private, closest confidants. And he began to share his apprehension about Israel. And he made some statements that he felt that if something was going to happen to him, it might be because of Israel. And he also made comments that he knew that the powerful billionaire class in this country that helped create him were now angry at him. Not all, not everyone, as he said on Megyn Kelly's show, and some were nuanced. He says, but there were others that were just coming right after him and calling him an anti-Semitic individual. They were judging him for his changing views and for his outspoken and for willingness to platform people like David Smith and others. So this is not something which surprised me about my understanding seconds after the assassination that it could be Israel. I was stunned to find out that this was happening almost across the board. Many individuals began to suspect this. By that night, there were YouTube videos going up by very independent podcasters saying, could this be Israel? The shot was a perfect shot. It was a one-shot hit. They had two flubbed individuals that they had let go, that they did not. One who was a Jew, an older Jew, who said, shoot me, when he was caught. And yet they let him go, and they let go of another individual that nobody even knows. So it was odd in that regard, that you had some very strange, obviously unusual things happening, very unusual, very, very unusual circumstances surrounding this assassination. But it hit me almost instantly, just because of my experience in politics and my understanding of the Jewish state, that how rogue they are. They don't care. The real concern is, now many have said this on podcasts for this past week, but I sensed it immediately. And people are calling themselves experts, and I'm not an expert, but I knew that almost immediately that Israel could not afford such a huge young figure in America who had 15 to 20 million followers with a $350 million budget, who was to open access to the White House, who knew the appointees personally and probably lobbied for some of them to get their positions, in fact, in the FBI office particularly, and other cabinet officials. And him and J.D. Vance were extremely close. And J.D. Vance, they said, was supported by Kirk to get picked by Trump to be the vice president. It was Vance that Kirk promoted to Trump to become the vice presidential pick, which is interesting. I read that by one report. But so when you have a person at this magnitude, at this age, who easily could have become a U.S. senator, who easily could become maybe one day even the leader of the conservative movement in this country when Trump passes away, that to have him turning away from his ardent support, 150% support of Israel, to start to question the Jeffrey Epstein files, ties to Israel openly, to question what they're doing in Gaza. Why are we spending billions and billions and billions upon Israel for no reason, no good reason? Every year we give them like a guilt debt card, because we somehow, somewhere in the 1940s, once upon a time, Franklin Roosevelt turned back a ship of Jews who went around and eventually had to go back, and whatever happened to them, they passed away, and it was unfortunate. Because of that, for the next 80 years, we have to be indebted to the state of Israel that Harry Truman helped create. So my thoughts are today is that it's tragic. It is a historical event in our country's modern politics, in our culture, and millions of young people are affected, including people like my son. I'm not a Charlie Kirk apologist. I think some of his statements were very, very blunt. They were shock value statements. They were done on purpose. Things he said about, gay individuals, they were very divisive, and he promoted it with a smile of that he was a born-again Christian and he was saved by the blood of the Lamb, which is, I'm not going to judge his personal faith, but I even heard recently by Max Blumenthal report that he began to somewhat change his affiliation to the Protestant evangelicalism. He began to attend the Catholic Church with his wife, who was Roman Catholic. So that would be a sea change for an ardent evangelical Christian Zionist to join in with and become, say, move towards the Catholic Church. I could see why he would, because they're very strong pro-life and very conservative individuals, but they don't have the same, ebullient fervor of the Messiah complex of coming, that Israel is going to play this unique role in the end times, even though the scriptures speak about some type of role with Israel, and Jesus does return according to the scriptures to, the Mount of Olives. But to link that to the secular warring government of Netanyahu and to the U.S. moneymen and say that's part of Christianity, it's insane. It's just insane. Christ, the Prince of Peace, is joined with a war criminal and his gang of thugs and bullies. Kirk was allegedly heard saying in the last few months about Netanyahu to private confidants again that Netanyahu was a bully, that he was a liar, and he was a thorough liar, and that he was beginning to change his views. And apparently, according to one report, he even told Trump not to drop bombs on Iran, not to go to war with Iran. And Trump, according to this report, got angry at him and told him to leave, which is unusual. But Kirk was beginning to do what a lot of young people do. They start coming out of their early, hell-bent convictions, and as the world begins to shape up in ways that they doesn't fully coordinate with their worldview or their moral and spiritual views, they begin to change. The morality of Israel cannot be defended. The immorality of Israel cannot be defended. The warring state of Israel cannot be defended. And it was odd, I thought, that same week, in fact, the day or two before Kirk was assassinated, Israel was being strongly criticized across the world for their attack on a peaceful mediation effort by a non-combatant country, Qatar. Qatar was, if anything, as a U.S. ally, the huge U.S. air base, was consistently involved in getting Israeli hostages released repeatedly this past year and a half. And we were the centerpiece and central location of mediation efforts between Hamas and Israel. And Trump had just sent a quote-unquote final option for Hamas to consider, and they were considering, they were meeting. And many, many people were looking at Hamas, looking at Israel like, how dare you attack and try to assassinate peace negotiators in a neutral country? And their talk at that time before Charlie was killed was Trump involved? Was Trump included in the planning stages? And people like Scott Ritter and very, very intelligent analysts who understand military affairs way better than any layperson could ever, said there's no doubt that Israel had to inform the United States of its attack on Qatar days before, because they'd have to clear the airspace and they'd have to make sure the radars, if they picked up Israeli planes flying in that direction, would be understood as what they were doing. We have satellite watch over that area. We have major Air Force bases, including one right in Qatar. And you mean to tell me that their radars didn't pick up those events? Qatar is making an excuse that these were radar evading missiles or drones coming from planes launched by Israel. That's nonsense. You think the largest Air Force base in the Mideast wasn't capable of picking up Israelis' attack, even as the planes were launched 800,000-900,000 miles away? These are the Gulf states. This isn't the direct Arab neighbors of Egypt and Lebanon and Syria. This is Gulf. Those planes had to fly distances to get to their targeting. So we definitely knew that was happening. Not minutes before the attack, as Qatar said. Qatar says they weren't notified until 10 minutes after the attack. Trump's administration openly tried to say we got military information and we sent it to Qatar as the attack was impending. Qatar came out that day and said there was no pre-warning, no 10-minute warning prior. It was 10 minutes after the attack occurred we were given notice. He says we have it logged. So you can't. That was the news. That was the news cycle. So, and Netanyahu was being roundly condemned by the world. And even Trump, on the day after that attack, said, I'm not thrilled. I'm not thrilled. That was his quote. I'm not happy with the way they did this. So he tried to distance himself. And Netanyahu then quickly says, I take full responsibility. And so what happens the third day into that controversy, which was just revving the world up and revving the United States up. And everybody in Washington was on their back foot, because how dare they attack a peace negotiation in a neutral country that's a U.S. ally? And Scott Ritter said, of course Trump knew. And it's a pattern. It's a perfidy, he called it. He says, we did it to Iran. We did it to the Hezbollah. We had peace negotiations going on, and we set up the moment. We literally set him up for the kill by saying, hey, we have a peace negotiations. Trump sends a letter to Hamas, the negotiators in Qatar, sends it through Wyckoff. I did a video about it. And what happens? If Israel was involved in any way, if they were involved in any way in assassinating Charlie Kirk, they completely wiped that story off the front pages of every national and international news media. And it certainly wiped it off the minds of anybody in Washington. The whole Qatar thing was put to bed overnight with the death of Charlie Kirk. And Netanyahu comes out immediately and says, what a great friend he was of ours, and we were great friends, and he was a wonderful person. That was not Charlie's position on Netanyahu, and Netanyahu knew it. At the end of his life, Charlie had begun to really question Netanyahu and his government, and he began to grow his independent mind. And because of his influence, because of the organization he had and the reach that it had into conservative circles, if Charlie would stay on that trajectory and wasn't pulled back into the Zionistic fold, he would have been a dangerous person to the idea that this country has to 110% support Israel at every turn and give them billions and billions of dollars upon demand and refund their killing machine every month. Every day, every week, we fund that military machine. We arm it. They could not do what they're doing in Gaza or Iran or Qatar without the U.S. military. It's that simple. And that doesn't even include the money we spend on stationing those aircraft carriers and destroyers and God knows what else in that region to protect Israel. So Charlie Kirk's death was a seminal event, and it's very, very sad. And I don't agree with anybody making fun of it or making fun of him. It's a sad day in America. And I do not agree with anybody who would mock him, regardless of his speech, which was hateful, which was very, at times, I believe, racist. He didn't deserve to be slaughtered like that in front of the watching world. And for a young generation to experience that, it's just disturbing. Nobody gains by violence. And if you're a Christian especially, I don't care what your background is, to mock that or say that he deserved that is incompatible with your faith, incompatible with human morality, even if you're not a Christian. I've heard people denounce his racism. That's fine. I've heard preachers talk about his racist background. That's fine. But don't support the violence that was done and perpetrated against him. Malcolm X said something about Kennedy being shot, and he said, well, the chickens are coming home to roost. That's Malcolm X's famous quote about John F. Kennedy dying, being murdered. Well, Malcolm, the chickens came to roost on you too. The same chickens, in fact. That one bullet that traveled from Dallas, and that bullet went through Brooklyn too. And then it made a U-turn and went to Memphis. And then it made a long trip out to LA, and it took out Robert. And that bullet seems to be still flying, is what I'm trying to say. That bullet has gone through numerous political and major cultural iconic figures. So when you make a statement like the chickens are coming home to roost, and you think you're arrogant, watch out, because the bullet's coming for you too. Thank you, and this is the Midwest Center for September 16th, 2025.